couple of months ago, I was running into some of my friends at the North Shore Civil War Roundtable, and they said there was a really great speaker, Jamie Malinowski, who wrote a book about Commander Cushing. So I guess, well, let's have him on the show. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so I don't think too many people in the audience know who Commander Cushing was, and can you tell them who he was?
Sure, he was a naval hero in the Civil War, a young, adventuresome type. He was often compared to Custer in terms of a kind of a courageous, straight-ahead, go right at him kind of leader who had tremendous battlefield success. And in his most famous exploit, he underwent what can only be called a David versus Goliath mission in attacking a Confederate ironclad in an open boat and sinking it with a torpedo while under tremendous fire. So he was very famous, in the 19th century. He'd be the kind of fellow you would go to a bank on New Year's Day to pick up a new calendar, and they'd have pictures of American heroes on the calendar, and he'd be one of them. So people would know him then, but he died young, and his fame sort of died out with his generation, and he became less and less well known until he's now almost, an obscure, forgotten figure.
Why did you decide to do this book? Because, most Civil War historians do not focus on naval heroes or naval personnel at all.
Well, the fact of the matter is I had known about Will Cushing since I was 8 years old, and there was a beautiful double-page painting of his exploit in Life magazine in 1961, and it made such a incredible impression on me that I remembered it all my life, and I would read up on him from time to time, and see what this book had to say about him or that book had to say about him. And then a few years ago, I was looking for a book topic, and I was telling my agent about this remarkable character whom almost no one had heard of, and we were able to get a sale out of it. So, it's true. The Navy kind of takes a back seat in exploits about the war, but it's probably undeserved. The blockade that the Union Navy placed around the entire coastline of the Confederacy was probably the single most determining factor in undermining the Confederacy's ability to wage war.
What was Will Cushing's background before the Civil War?
He was a youth. Before the Civil War, he was in the Naval Academy, and he was a rebellious upstart who, constantly in trouble, who finally got kicked out of the Naval Academy just about 2 months before his graduation in February of 1861. And his antics are a great part of his legend, and who knows really what would have happened to him. But the war broke out soon after, and the Union Navy needed officers, and so he was an almost fully trained officer, and so they brought him back, and from there he kind of worked his way back in, was much more serious-minded, and eventually saw real action starting in 1862, and from that point on, it's one dispatch after another, praising Lieutenant Cushing for this and commenting on his bravery here and his valor there and his remarkable feat here, and over and over and over, which is why they chose him for this mission to sink this ironclad that was dominating the Roanoke River in North Carolina, and it had beaten all the Union ships to a draw, and finally they said, we're going to need somebody to go up there on a suicide mission, and who can we get? And the minute they asked Will, he was 21 years old, and he said, hell yeah, I'll go.
And exactly what happened on the mission, if you can describe it briefly.
Sure. He went up the river in a boat with about 8 other guys, and I think his intention was to do what's called a cutting out operation. You kind of rush the boat in the dead of night. There very seldom is a guard on the boat. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 guards, but the crew would not sleep on the boat. And you'd cut the ropes and set the ship adrift, hope that they were, keeping the engine fires, at a low level so that you could quickly rev them back up, and essentially you would, steal the boat. And that was a kind of, there really aren't too many examples of it in the Civil War, but there are many, many examples of it in the British Navy and the Napoleonic era of, one hero after another sneaking into an Egyptian port or, and stealing a French ship like that, called a cutting out operation. But when Will got up there, up to Plymouth, where the Albermarle was docked in the middle of the night, he found that it was protected by a log boom. And moreover, while the sentries were asleep, the dogs were awake, and the dogs started barking and alerted everybody was there. But he had this a spar torpedo, a kind of bomb with him that was a highly ineffectual weapon, but he nonetheless vaulted the log boom, got right under the ship's guns, and floated this torpedo underneath the Albemarle and detonated it. And by rights, the explosion ought to have killed him and his men, and certainly the tremendous fire that he was under ought to have got him. The heel of his boot was shot off, the back of his coat was shot off, the sleeve of his jacket was torn, but he himself was not hit. And but the explosion went off, and the ship was sunk. And then he made this amazing escape, slinking through the swamps and bogs, and eventually stealing a rowboat from a Confederate posse and making it back to the Union fleet.
Now, you mentioned he died young. What happened?
He was diagnosed with something called rheumatism of the hip, which is not a diagnosis anybody uses anymore. And of course, we don't have any vials with his blood serum in it or anything like that. So we really don't know what it was, but it might have been a kind of cancer. It might have been an infection that got to him. But he was gradually incapacitated or limited in his movements, and then it caused him tremendous pain in the last couple of weeks of his life. So much so that he became, essentially, delusional.
What year did he pass away?
1874.
What did he do for the 9 years after the war then, for those from 1865 to 1874? He
remained in the Navy. He went for 2 years to the Far East and had adventures in shopping, as a good American tourist would. But he also had a tremendous adventure in Cuba, where he stood up against a Spanish martinet who was executing U.S. sailors accused of being aligned with the rebels. And Cushing went in and, aimed the guns at the palace, and then secured an appointment with the Spanish officer. And the man tried to shake hands with him because he was, of course, this great war hero, and Cushing wouldn't shake hands with him. And he said, I demand that you release these men. And the man said, well, I have to wait for orders from Spain before doing that. And Cushing said, well, then I would be grateful if you would remove the women and children from the palace, because I wouldn't want to do them any harm. And it was that sort of Clint Eastwood-like line that the guy just backed down. And the next morning he fled town, and the prisoners were released.
Okay, so...
And what's remarkable is that he was kicked out of the Naval Academy for failing a Spanish exam. And so I don't know whether he spoke Spanish to this man or not, but he made himself clear. So I thought that was a nice way to round out the story.
Now, I know of people failing out of West Point. It wasn't really that unusual. It wasn't. I would say it was not a disgrace. Annapolis, I assume, was the same way back then?
Yes. I mean, well, of course it was a disgrace to some degree. I mean, his father died when he was 4. His mother raised him. It would have been a disappointment to Mom if he had been kicked out. And, there had been family connections that had, been used to get him in there. So he would have suffered somewhat. But, I mean, he would have, of course, recovered in being a fellow of, a bright and ingenious fellow. I'm sure, though, he would have had, many opportunities for some kind of success. But um, it was really a case of him. I think once he realized he kept pushing the limits and pushing the limits, thinking he could always pull back, and finally he ran into an official at the school who was not having it, and I think it was a sobering effect. I mean, he was only 20 or not even 19 at that point. So young people make mistakes, and it was a kind of in those couple of months between his dismissal and his reinstatement, it was sobering and kind of, made him realize what he had squandered.
Did he ever have any political aspirations, or he just wanted to be a naval officer?
Well, I never got that far for political aspirations. I always sort of wondered that when you look at the many Union generals who became president after the war, and many of them were sort of not even that big as heroes. Grant, of course, was, but Garfield and Rutherford B. Hayes, they were sort of fairly inconsequential fellows. So you can imagine that he would have been recruited had his mind gone that way. But I think he was more of a man of action. He's really, he has the personality of today we would think of it like an astronaut. Someone who really is, doesn't really give in to fears about danger, is the excitement of trying something and the thrill of an adventure and of an opportunity to do something that no one's done before is really the motivating factor. So I could see him, I could easily see him staying in the military, but if he left the United States Navy, I would, maybe he'd be one of those fellows who, went around the world, as a mercenary or an explorer or any of those kinds of large figures from the 19th century.
Now, did he have any relatives in the Civil War?
Oh, sure. Of course. Will was one of 4 brothers, and all of them served in uniform. The eldest, Milton, was a paymaster in the Navy, and he didn't see any action, but he served honorably. The second oldest, Howard, was an artilleryman who fought at Vicksburg and Shiloh and Chancellorsville and numerous battles, survived the war, became a cavalry lieutenant, and died a heroic death fighting the Apache. The brother just above Will, Alonzo Cushing, was a West Point graduate, fought in Virginia, in Fredericksburg and Antietam, and even was in the first Battle of Bull Run, and died at Gettysburg, one of the great heroes. Those who study the Civil War talk about how Lee stood there and said, "I want you to told his officers, focus your attack on that little copse of trees." Well, Alonzo Cushing and his battery was under that little copse of trees and was right at the center of the rebel attack. And Alonzo fought with great valor and great determination until he was killed. And his steadfast courage earned him the Medal of Honor in 2014 from President Obama.
Commander Will Cushing, Daredevil Hero of the Civil War, by Jamie Malinowski. Thank you for bringing history to life. And I understand you're going to be speaking at the Civil War Roundtable this fall.
Yeah, I am. I'm looking forward to it. I've had the pleasure of speaking to about 20 groups, and I enjoy it very much. I got to speak at the Naval Academy, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, Will Cushing is, if you like Steve McQueen in The Great Escape, if you like Tom Cruise in Top Gun, well, Will's like the prototype. Will's the real deal. And I enjoy bringing his story to life to people.
Okay, and those Navy veterans out there who keep complaining we have too many Army guys talked about during the Civil War Roundtable, here's your chance to even up the score a little bit.
And write a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. There have been 6 ships named after Will Cushing. There is not currently a U.S. Navy vessel named after him, but they are developing a new ship called a littoral vessel, a littoral combat ship that fights, close inland, and it's being considered naming it after Will. And write a letter and recommend it, because it's sort of the perfect kind of it's the kind of vessel that you could see him commanding in shallow waters of North Carolina and Virginia.
Now, you think the Secretary of the Navy knows who Will Cushing was?
The Navy has been more loyal to Will's memory than any other institution. There's a great portrait of him at the Naval Academy. There are one of the streets at the Naval War College in Rhode Island is named after him, and there's a large Cushing Alumni Association of all the sailors who have served on the various Cushing incarnations. So I don't know whether the current guy knows him or not, but a lot of people do.
Commander Will Cushing, daredevil hero of the Civil War. Thank you, Jamie, for being on our show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.